Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. And I'd like to use this session to show you guys the various ways to which you can store information in a user's browser. All right, so I have three sets of login pages, and three of them have different ways to store data. I'm going to be explaining the benefits and also the limitations for each of these three different means of storing data in a user's browser. Now, the first storage that I'm going to show you guys is the session storage. The second is the cookie storage. And the last is a local storage. I'm going to provide valuable information as to how you can quickly create and utilize the storage mechanism and also the pitfalls that surround each storage mechanism. I'd like to point out the benefits of each storage mechanism and also the applications of each storage mechanism. Most times, as a web developer, you may want to store information on a user's browser. That way, you don't have to query your database frequently. This will just reduce the load. That's when storage cookies come in handy. For example, you may want to store a user's preference, such as their music playlist or their theme design. And sometimes you may want to store shopping cart data. Now let's start with the session storage. Now this value here is a user's password and this is the user's email. Now session variables actually work differently from cookie storage and local storage. So no matter how I refresh this page, the information remains the same. This is the code that I've used to create these persistent data. This is the session storage mechanism. This way I've been able to store or assign the session variable the value of the email and the password, thereby making these values persistent. The same for the cookies. Now I'm going to be showing you guys when to use these various storage mechanisms and when not to use them. Session variables are really important when you're trying to pass information from one web page to another. This way, you don't have to necessarily query your database to pull out information and simply just making an initial verification and storing the values inside of the session variable, you can quickly access these values on all your web pages. Session variables are also encrypted. So that means on a user's browser, they cannot access the values of the session variables. These are the limitations for session variables. Now, when I close the browser, the session variables are automatically destroyed. So session variables are accessible on all your web pages. However, session variables are destroyed once the browser is closed. So just like the name implies, a user is having a session, and once that session is finished, the values are destroyed. So I'm going to close this window and you're going to see that this persistent data will no longer exist. As you can see, the session variables are no longer available. And if we check the cookie variable, as you can see, the values are still accessible. That means this cookie does not have the limitation or does not expire when the user closes the browser. And as you can see, the local storage also still has the values. So to point out, for session variables, the values only exist for that session. So as soon as the user closes the browser, those values are immediately destroyed. Cookie storage, however, are great for persistent data over a long period of time. I have set this cookie to expire after 7 days. So that means this data will persist on the user's browser for the next 7 days. Even if they close their browser, this data will still be accessible just by targeting the cookie name. To unset the cookie, you could simply set the expiration date to a period that has already passed, and this will simply unset or destroy a cookie. So these are the two ways you can actually unset or destroy a cookie storage. You either set the expiration date to a timeline that has already passed, or you can simply allow the session variable to reach its expiring period. And this is great for shopping cart list storage. What you want to do is simply store the shopping cart data as a cookie. That way, the user can have persistent data for the period of time that the session cookie was set. Now, the setbacks for using session cookie or using a direct cookie storage is that the values are actually accessible from the user's browser. So the data is not encrypted. So just setting these values for security reasons isn't the wisest option. Let's say you want to store a user's credit card details. You wouldn't want to store that data in a cookie variable because the information will be accessible by the user's browser. Now, the same thing also for local storage. The data when stored is not encrypted. Also, for local storage, there is a limit as to how much data you can store in a user's local storage because you're essentially storing a small file in the user's browser, which is ultimately the user's device. And this small file will have the values of the variables you've created or assigned, and the memory allotted for local storage is around 5 megabytes to 10 megabytes. So if your data that you're storing in the local storage of the user's device is greater than 10 MB, you may have storage issues. This is advisable for non-sensitive data when you're trying to store possibly a user's preference as to their playlist, their theme color. Then you can use a local storage or the cookie storage. Now in my code here, I can simply unset the cookie by setting the expiration date to a timeline that has already passed. Now if I refresh this page, you'll see that the values here will no longer exist. As you can see, the cookie variables have been destroyed, and that is because I have expired or set their expiration date to a timeline that has already passed. For the local storage, to unset this persistent data, you just need one line of code, local storage.clear. This JavaScript function will simply destroy the local storage data that you've stored on the user's device. As you can see, the local storage data doesn't exist anymore. The local storage is limited to JavaScript only because this is client-side protocol, and this simply communicates with the user's browser, and JavaScript is well suited for that. If you're looking to store data permanently, such as a user's password, possibly a user's bank details, or a user's profile, that way you can pull out this information, modify the information, delete the information, then the best approach is to use a database. This also provides persistent data, but also it frees the user's memory. So that way, all of the data or information is stored in a remote server, and then you can simply fetch or retrieve this information when the users want and evaluate on certain conditions before displaying or allowing the user to modify this information. Using a database is the best approach to ensure fast and also persistent permanent data for the user. Now, over the course of this training, we're going to be highlighting some of these methods, logics that surrounds database management. We're going to be using PHP, MySQL to actually modify data in a remote server. To recap, I showed you guys the various ways you can store data in a user's device. Session storage allows you to store data that is persistent for the user session. That means when they close their browser, all of the information is lost. Cookie storage helps you store information for a period of time. So over a specific period of time, the user or the browser is going to have data that remains persistent. Local storage stores information in the user's browser and is only done using JavaScript. So this is a client-side request and can never be done using a server-side programming like PHP. Finally, database management. This way, you can store information permanently and be able to modify this information using columns and rows. Alright guys, the various ways you can store information in a user's device and also outline the limitations and benefits of each. So depending on your goal, you're going to have to figure out which storage mechanism suits your need. If you're just trying to keep track of a user's login and say you want to monitor how they use your product, then a session variable or cookie variable is ideal. But if you're trying to store user preference, shopping cart data, then using a cookie variable or storing the information in the user's local storage is the best approach. Finally, if you want to actually store data permanently, then you should use a remote database management system. Alright guys, I'll see you on the next one.